Teddy and I had been working at Disney for years. The two of us had seen hundreds, if not thousands, of young cast members come and go, heading off to college or to better jobs and brighter futures. Meanwhile, the two of us stuck around and became a running joke to some of the younger employees, since we were never promoted to management, that is. Most of the lower-level members were young, in their early 20s or late teens, and to them, it was just a part-time gig, a way to raise money for college or to pass a bit of time until their real lives and careers began. But Teddy and I were lifers, and some would say losers. Although I would never attach that label to myself willingly, I'd heard it whispered enough times to know that it was what other people thought of us. We'd both been there for nearly 2 decades, and had worked on pretty much every single attraction, but had never been deemed responsible enough to be promoted to supervisor status. Over all that time, I found a lot of secrets about the place. Some things that are known to the public, but also some revelations that aren't talked about anywhere. Did you know that cast members who work as mascots have to wear communal underwear? Yeah, that's right. They all share the same underoos, and they get washed in between uses. At least, in theory. Who knows what pervert came up with that idea? Or how about the fact the skeleton on the Pirates of the Caribbean ride was originally constructed out of real bones? Despite the park's insistence that all the bones were removed, a few still remain. Management lost track of which were real and which were fake, and they just left the real ones in there along with the imposters. But when you're up close, it's easy to tell them apart. The real ones are a little more yellow, and they're heavier than the plaster ones. There are plenty of morbid secrets like that. People scatter the ashes of their deceased loved ones in the park so frequently, we actually have a not-so-subtle code name for it. A white powder alert. The Haunted Mansion and the Pirates of the Caribbean are the most common places, but it's done all over. And who knows how often people get away with it without even being noticed. Code 101 means a ride is temporarily shut down, while Code V, or a protein spill, means that someone has vomited on a ride and it needs to be cleaned up. Those spills are often the cause of ride shutdowns, rather than mechanical issues. Oh, and if you hear yourself or someone else being referred to as a treasured guest, it doesn't mean you're a VIP. It's actually our code word for saying you're being an asshole. There are stories of ghosts, some told by people who never believed in such things before witnessing them in the park. The specter of Walt Disney himself has been seen a couple of times, outside Sleeping Beauty's castle just on the other side of the drawbridge. Or sometimes he's seen at night just outside his old apartment on Main Street, where occasionally you might smell a whiff of cigarette smoke, despite the fact that such things are banned inside the park. Walt and his family once lived there, so they could spy on visitors and listen to their opinion on the park. They would eavesdrop on their conversations from the second-floor apartment, just above the street level. George, a dead electrician, supposedly haunts the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, and every morning, cast members must call out, "Good morning, George," at the start of the day. Otherwise, the ride will mysteriously have issues all day long. Unexpected shutdowns and other strange things often occur if George isn't given his proper morning greeting. And have you heard about the animatronics in It's a Small World running all night long? Yep, those rumors are true too. In fact, quite a few of the lifelike robots stay in motion 24/7, even throughout the lockdown and park shutdowns a couple of years back. If you ask the management about it, they'll tell you it's because the attractions are cheaper to maintain that way. They break down less frequently if they're in constant motion. That's the excuse we get anyway. But I've come to realize there might be far more terrifying reasons for this. Something so disturbing and twisted that I wouldn't have thought it was possible if I hadn't witnessed it for myself. Teddy and I were on our lunch break when we found the storage room. We were looking for somewhere a little more private since Teddy had brought a bit of homemade greenery and his favorite piece of glassware that day. The park has miles and miles of tunnels crisscrossing beneath it, and Teddy and I had explored most of the labyrinth over our years of service. Like everything else in the park, there was a stupid nickname for these underground tunnels. They had been dubbed utilidors by some management types in the distant past. Most of the cast members just called them the tunnels, and they were so vast we often used golf carts to get from one end of them to the other. There were odd dead ends at some of the tunnels that seemed to intentionally lead to nowhere. We were currently in one such useless utilidor when we noticed an odd-looking door which appeared to be at least half a century old, if not more. It had a rusted placard hanging over its surface which read, "Obsolete animatronic storage." "Hey, didn't there used to be a vending machine there?" Teddy asked. "Who cares? Let's see if it opens. We've only got 20 minutes left," I said, looking at the time on my cell phone. The doorknob turned in my hand, and the two of us went inside. I looked for a light switch on the wall to my right, but I didn't find one. It was pitch black and impossible to see anything. Using the flashlight on my phone, I cast a beam of light around the room, trying to see what kind of space we were in. There were people-shaped forms all around us, draped in tarps and tablecloths. The room was as long as a football field, but it was narrow, only about 15 feet across. "Creepy," Teddy said, taking the words right out of my mouth. Well, I guess it did say this was animatronic storage. This must be really old. He wandered away from the door, and it clicked shut behind him. Something about that made me nervous, but I had ignored the feeling. The door had been unlocked, and that meant we'd be able to get out again. Still, I reached for the knob to check it. My hand was about to touch the polished brass when Teddy called out, making me jump. "Whoa! Check this out!" he said, sounding excited. I left the door, turning around to see what he was looking at. He had his cell phone light on as well, and was lifting up one of the tarps to look at what was underneath. "Man, this thing's freaky looking." He pulled the tarp away, and I saw what he meant. The thing hidden beneath was very creepy. It had the goateed face of a young man, but the ears and nubby horns of a goat, looking far too real. Its lower half looked like it also belonged to a goat. The thing reminded me of a satyr, those drunken, lustful half-goat gods from Greek mythology. I tried to figure out why it was making me feel so uneasy, and realized it was the eyes. They were too lifelike, far more real than the animatronics out in the park, and the look of the skin, the way it reflected the light and anything about it, it looked like it was a real creature. More likely, a man had been sewn to the body of a goat in a very thorough way, making the seams blend together perfectly. Teddy was already moving on to the next one, looking under another tarp. He left me alone with this one, and I looked back down at it as I let go of the cover and let it fall across its face again. Flinching backwards, I nearly screamed, as I could have sworn the eyes of the thing were looking at me, just as I dropped the tarp over its face. My heart was beating fast, and I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, or that the eyes had been looking up that way the whole time, and I just hadn't noticed. "We need to go," I heard myself say, but Teddy wasn't listening. "Holy crap, this one's even more jacked up. Dude, you gotta check this out." I opened my mouth to say, "No, let's get out of here," but my words caught in my throat. The satyr creature under the tarp was clearly moving now. Its head was still draped in the plastic sheet, but I could see it turning to look at me, as if its gaze could penetrate through the tarp. "Dude, come check this out," Teddy was yelling, pulling the next sheet off and dropping it to the floor. I saw what he was referring to, my eyes drawn to it despite the terror of the draped creature just in front of me. This one was tall, standing nearly 10 feet. It had one large eye instead of two. Man, whoever made these things was tripping on acid or something. Look at this thing. It looks like they jacked an eye from an elephant and stuffed it in some dude's forehead. I think they were trying to make a cyclops. I could barely hear him, as now the thing in front of me wasn't the only figure in the room which was moving. To my left, The entire row of covered forms were beginning to stretch and turn as they woke up from whatever sleep they had been in. Some were tall, some were short, like the satyr thing on my right, but all of them were alive. I realized it was very cold all of a sudden, and realized I could see my breath steaming out in the air. A compressor groaned to life, and I saw a nearby vent cough out a frosty plume as if something had been jammed or broken and was suddenly operating again. The temperature in the room began to plummet, and a second later, I was freezing cold, the rushing air chilling the back of my neck. Finally, I was shocked out of my stupor and managed to get a word out. "Teddy!" I croaked, but too late. The giant Cyclops hand shot out and grabbed my friend by the throat. It lifted him up into the air while his legs kicked and his arms thrashed, trying to break its grip. He was choking and sputtering, flailing madly as he tried to free himself. The Cyclops firmly held him by the throat, and I heard the sound of cartilage and bones being crushed. His spine popped, and his head bent back at an impossible angle, his skull lolling backwards like a broken Pez dispenser. And then the giant dropped him to the concrete floor of the room, and his phone clattered and turned over, casting half the room in darkness again. I backed away, feeling like I was moving in slow motion, but unable to go any quicker. Reaching back for the doorknob, it felt like the tunnel had grown by 100 feet. It was further away than it could possibly have ever been. I kept backing up, taking slow, quiet steps. The figures were moving towards me, all of them closing the gap and slowly walking in my direction. Their forms were covered, draped in bed sheets and tarps and tablecloths, as if this place had been thrown together in a hurry, hastily constructed to house these possessed animatronics or whatever these creatures were. Cold air was filling the room, making it even more difficult to move. My skin felt like it was being stabbed with pins and needles, the freezing wind going right through my summer clothes. There was a sound of tearing flesh and blood being spilled. I looked to see several of the monsters were tearing the skin from Teddy's face, peeling it from his bones with some difficulty, like trying to open an underripe orange. The worst part was, it looked like he was still alive. He was opening and closing his mouth like a fish out of water, his eyes wide open as if he'd be screaming if he were capable of it. I tried to tear my eyes away from it, but I couldn't. I found myself staring at him as they took the flesh off his face. I backed up hard into something and realized it was the door. In the darkness, I felt for the doorknob behind me, but I couldn't find it. The creatures were still moving towards me, all of their faces covered by sheets except for the massive Cyclops that had killed my friend. Its one huge eye was fixed on me, and as it moved in lockstep with the other creatures, they all seemed to share one hive mind. As they approached, a few stepped on each other's coverings, tearing them away and revealing their hideous faces. I saw a woman's upper body sewn onto the legs of a deer, and a man with the hindquarters of a bull, their faces full of mute anger. My hand groped for the doorknob desperately, and after several long moments, it settled on the smooth brass. It was so cold, almost frozen. I spun around, expecting the doorknob to turn easily, but this time it was stuck. I couldn't tell if it was locked or frozen solid, but either way it wouldn't budge. Feeling like there would be icy hands around my throat at any second, I was too terrified to turn around. I heard the sound of shuffling feet moving closer, the icy wind blowing through my clothes and raising goosebumps on my skin. I began pounding against the door with my fists, banging on it as hard as I could as I screamed for help, pleading for someone to save me. "Help! Help! Open the door!" I yelled at the top of my lungs. The corridor we had entered was a dead end, rarely used by anyone. Of course, this door would be locked from the inside, I thought to myself. Who would offer an escape to these animatronic demons? If they had ever been imbued with any form of failsafe, it was long ago out of commission and useless. These creatures had no mercy and no respect for human life. They wanted blood and flesh and meat to create more of themselves, to raise an army of undead robotic soldiers. Manic thoughts were racing through my head as I tried to think of another way out. There had to be something, some other way out. I turned around, hoping for some other exit to present itself, but instead I just saw hundreds of shrouded forms stepping closer and closer until they were just a few feet away. A gurgling, wheezing sound could be heard from behind them, and I realized it was the labored breathing of Teddy slowly dying. If I didn't get out of here, I'd be next. With one desperate move, I kicked out towards the head of the nearest shrouded figure. It was the satyr. My foot connected with his face, and as it did, the entire crowd fell back a step, as if hurting one of them would hurt all of them. I lashed out with another blow, punching it in the gut, and the crowd took another wounded step backward. I used the newfound space to my advantage and took a short running start towards the door. Kicking it hard with my boot, I connected squarely with the spot behind the doorknob. It rattled in the frame, but it didn't budge. Taking a quick look back over my shoulder, I saw the crowd of animatronic creatures were coming at me again with renewed anger. They looked furious at me for assaulting one of them, and apparently I had injured it. The satyr was slumped forward, its joints making creaky noises as it made its way towards me, its movements jerky and disorganized. I kicked the door again, harder this time, using every ounce of force I could muster. I heard something splinter and break, but it still wouldn't budge. Icy hands grabbed my throat from behind, and I threw an elbow backward to try to break free. It connected with whatever had grabbed me, and it didn't let go. Instead, its grip tightened, choking and squeezing my throat until I couldn't breathe. I let out another strangled cry for help, but no sound came out this time. The grip on my windpipe was making it impossible to call out. My feet were going numb from the cold, which seemed to have intensified even more somehow. I hadn't thought it was possible to feel any colder, but I realized that whoever was controlling the temperature of this place was doing this on purpose. These things didn't like the cold, and it put them in a state of hibernation. For some reason, this place had been almost room temperature when we entered, bringing these creatures back to life. With one more desperate effort, I lifted my leg and kicked as hard as I could, my heel connecting with the door just beside the latch. Something shattered and broke loudly, and the door swung open on its hinges. The momentum brought me forward, and I found myself tumbling back into the corridor. Whatever had grabbed hold of me came with me, the icy hand still around my neck. As I landed, the thing's fingers broke off like icicles, shattering on impact. The shrouded creature was writhing on the floor, looking as if it wanted to get up and chase me, but wasn't quite capable of it yet. It was still too cold. I stumbled to my feet and ran from there, not really thinking about my mistake until I was far past that point. When it occurred to me what I had done, it was too late. I had let those things out. I'd opened the door and freed them, and I had allowed the warm air inside so they could come back to life and escape. I was too terrified to stay in the park. I went home immediately without saying a word to anyone, then called my boss and told him I was sick with a stomach flu. I apologized, saying I'd been throwing up in the bathroom and didn't want to cause a code V while on stage. He told me that was okay, since he knew I was a dedicated employee, trusted cast member who had been with the park for years. But he did ask if I'd seen Teddy, and I had to lie and tell him I hadn't. I'm supposed to go back to work tomorrow, for the first time since all of this happened. The worst part about it, nobody has reported Teddy missing. His family hadn't called to say anything either. It's almost like none of it ever happened. Except I've got the marks around my neck, the bruises that prove I didn't imagine it. I just got a strange message from Teddy on his cell phone. He says, "See you at work tomorrow, buddy," accompanied by a mouse emoji. Me and some of the cast members have a big surprise for you. You're still here. I thought you might be. Thanks for joining me for tonight's story. If your insatiable appetite for horror knows no bounds, might I suggest one of our playlists, or one of our previous stories in the archive? There should be one appearing at the end of the story any minute now. And of course, if you're not subscribed, why not go ahead and hit that subscribe button? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. If you prefer your horror a little more analog, you can always pick up one of my books. There's a link below to my latest, and it'll take you to all the great things that I've posted on Amazon. For my book lovers in the audience, I always suggest coming on down to Patreon so you can become part of my ghostly reader tier and get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. Speaking of my patrons, let's go ahead and thank them, shall we? Thanks to Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributor. Thanks to Janet and Lady Vengeance for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. Thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being our ghostly reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you think you might like to support the show in a more monetary fashion, come on down to Patreon. I have many tiers. I'm sure you'll find one that suits you best. I always recommend the Ghostly Reader tier, since you get a signed book anytime I write one on your doorstep. But I have many tiers, and again, I'm sure you'll find one to suit you. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.